Putin has ordered a partial mobilization in Russia as tacit admission that Moscow's war in Ukraine is not going to plan after nearly 7 months of intense and bloody fighting. Officially, 300,000 reservists will be drafted to support its military campaign, and the chaotic mobilization process has incited panic and an exodus of fighting-age men from Russia. But does anyone believe that the Russian government will stick to their stated limits of 300,000? After all, they claim that only 5,000 odd Russian soldiers have died in the campaign so far, whereas Western and Ukrainian sources put this number closer to 60,000. Today, I'm speaking with Ben Hodges, former Commanding General, US Army Europe, from 2014 through to 2017. Ben Hodges is now Senior Advisor at Human Rights First, and until recently was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, specializing in NATO, the transatlantic fellowship relationship, and international security. Ben, I'm hugely pleased and privileged to speak to you today.
Well, I am very grateful for the opportunity, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Well, let's jump straight into the questions here. And let's start with not the war itself, but let's start with the human rights point of view. And a lot of the debate I see on Twitter, especially from the extreme right and the extreme left, is a lot of whataboutism. But isn't it the case that the war that we are currently supporting Ukraine in, it's pretty morally unambiguous, probably the least ambiguous war since the Second World War?
Yeah, I think the differences are pretty clear. What the Russian Federation is doing is in violation of international law, using force to change borders, sham referenda, illegal annexation, murder of innocent civilians, targeting civilian areas with very expensive precision munitions. These are not accidents. And then, of course, causing disruption and life-threatening circumstances for millions of people because of blocking the shipment of grain and energy. So all of these things are part of the Russian way of war, not to mention undermining democracies around the world through malign influence and money and other means. So that's what this is about. Nobody's saying that Ukraine is perfect or that Europe is perfect or that the United States is perfect. But in terms of the moral circumstances of this conflict, which I think has been going on for about 30 years, actually, starting with this breakaway of Transnistria, then invasion of Georgia, then invasion of Crimea, support for Assad, and now what started in February. It's the new 30 years war.
It's true, isn't it? I mean, Putin hasn't eased into this role of an authoritarian imperialist almost straight out of the gate. He was inciting wars and strife and struggle. Even if the West didn't oppose him in those first few years, his pattern of behavior is pretty consistent, isn't it?
Yes, and while he has made several fatal strategic mistakes that are going to lead to the collapse of, I believe, the Russian Federation here in the coming years, and certainly their defeat on the battlefield, he was smart enough to recognize years ago that the West would be very, very slow to act decisively to what he was doing. And I think they calculated that the West would not stick together, that we would not really support Ukraine, which is, I think, part of why he went ahead back in February, feeling confident that he could get away with what he had been doing in previous years.
And I'm pretty sure you'll have a strong point of view on NATO. But one of the big arguments, of course, certainly on the far left, and I've been surprised in recent years to see on the far right a certain opposition to NATO, but. It's not the case that NATO, I think, encroachment caused the war. It's rather the frustration that NATO's existence, provides a check on the expansion of Russia back into what it perceives its sphere of influence. I think that's Putin's biggest frustration.
That is a great way to formulate that, because this argument somehow that this is really the fault of the West, and that we lied after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that NATO is encircling Russia is a total farce, and it's any serious person can see that. I mean, the question is, why do all the nations that used to be Soviet republics or under the Warsaw Pact, why did they go scrambling to join NATO and the EU as fast as they could? Because they know what it's like to be a part of the Russian Empire, whatever the name is. It's about being a part of the Russian Empire. None of them wanted that, so NATO offered that. So the idea that somehow NATO is expanding is a completely wrong way to describe it. And the safest part of Russia was always the part that touched NATO. That was the one place where they could be sure from which they would never be invaded. Estonia, Latvia, they're never going to invade Russia. And now, because of what President Putin has initiated, the amount of NATO that touches his border is doubling once Finland becomes a member of the alliance, and I think in a few years, Ukraine.
Absolutely. And if you look at the geographical mass of Russia, those NATO territories were a small minority of their geographic borders. It's quite an extraordinary argument there. So in your view, defeat is almost inevitable now, or at least defeat on the conventional battlefield is looking inevitable?
Yes, I think the Ukrainians have achieved irreversible momentum. Of course, it's too early to be planning victory parades, and this is going to go on for some time. But my sense is that so long as we, the US, the UK, and other allies and partners who have been supporting Ukraine, as long as we stick together, keep sanctions in place, continue to deliver what we said we're going to deliver, then I think Ukrainian forces are going to push the Russians back to the 23 February line by the end of this year, and that by the middle of next year that they will be in Crimea.
And I've heard Ian Ferguson and others say that you know, the arms and supplies delivered so far, of course, are great, but that actually the pace of that supply needs to increase. And I don't know the right term for it, but the caliber or the strength of that weaponry, including you know, main battle tanks, could help to end this faster.
Yeah, my only criticism of the Biden administration, which I believe has done a superb job consulting with allies, helping to keep things moving, and despite all of our own domestic challenges in the U.S., the Congress has continued to support large numbers of aid in terms of dollar amounts and quality. But the criticism is that they have self-deterred a little bit, because they have been concerned that if we provide a certain thing, that will do it, and that the Russians would somehow escalate. And I think this is an exaggerated thing. And in fact, the sooner we can deliver things like ATACMS, which is a 300-kilometer range rocket that could be fired from HIMARS, the sooner we start getting Abrams tanks or German Leopards or those kind of capabilities there, so that they can train and integrate that, that will accelerate the end of this war.
And turning to Crimea, I've got sort of two questions about what this conventional endgame might look like. How do you think it might pan out actually retaking Crimea? I mean, isn't that going to be geographically and physically quite a challenge? Or at that point, do you think the Russian forces are going to fold? I mean, how does that play out?
Well, of course, I'm going out on a limb here to predict how something as uncertain with so much fog and friction as is the nature of war. But I feel confident in making my assessment, because we know from history that war is a test of will and it's a test of logistics. And the Russian logistical system is exhausted, and it's going to get worse as Ukrainians continue to pound like they're doing now, ammunition storage sites, headquarters, as they continue to capture critical rail junctions like Lyman, which they apparently are doing as we speak. And then when you add however many number of newly mobilized troops show up, if it's 1, 2, 300,000 or more, that's added burden on the logistical system, which is already exhausted. So I think for that reason alone, and because of sanctions prevent the Russians from replacing all of their precision weapons, they're under enormous stress. But how does that get to Crimea? I think this counteroffensive that started back at the beginning of the month, we focused on Kherson, then we focused on the part that came down through Kharkiv and now has resulted in the capture apparently of Lyman. This is all one thing. I mean, it's one counteroffensive with different components. And the Ukrainian General Staff has impressed me with, first of all, their knowledge and skill of employing operational art, but also they seem to be agile enough to exploit opportunities as weaknesses are discovered and so on. They're being methodical in Kherson. There's no need to rush there to get into a bloody battle that would destroy the city. It's a Ukrainian city. But you do have several thousand Russian troops that are trapped there. So these things are all converging towards Crimea. I mean, if you think of it, on my imaginary air map here, I'm using my hands, from Kherson and then coming down, they will soon have HIMARS and other long-range rocket systems like the ones that UK has provided and Germany has provided that will be able to reach Russian bases in Crimea. And once that happens, then I think it's a matter of time that Crimea becomes untenable for Russian forces.
And of course, it's a huge psychological blow, isn't it? As we saw in the summer when Russians fled in panic, when I guess we still don't know whether it was drones or sabotage, but that made a huge impact, as well as looking extraordinarily impressive on social media. That creates a psychological fear and a sense of loss, doesn't it, in Russia?
Very, very well stated. The image of those people at the beach, like, what the heck is going on, revealed either total arrogance or total don't care or total not my problem. And the next day, instead of rushing to the recruiter's office saying, how do I fight to protect what is Holy Land, according to Putin, there was a massive traffic jam on that bridge for them trying to get out of there. So that was revealing. And it also pulled away the curtain or the sense of invulnerability, that they couldn't be hurt. Since then, the Russians, they have relocated the submarines of the Black Sea Fleet away from Sevastopol to their naval base, which is further to the east on the Russian mainland. So I think this was important psychologically, and it revealed to me a lack of will in the Russian population, which of course now has been put on very clear display with the hundreds of thousands of young men trying to get out of there.
Some of them, of course, the classic armchair patriots who were busy trying to get rid of their Z markings, Z haircuts. I believe I read some of their children had them, and they were desperately trying to get into Georgia, Mongolia even, and various places, Kazakhstan and so on. And there's a real difference, isn't there, when push comes to shove, when you're called to protect something which is your own, or in this case, fighting over essentially, someone else's stolen assets.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians are literally defending their homeland. And the vast majority of Russian soldiers who have been deployed into Ukraine are from ethnic regions well outside of Moscow. This is a traditional method of the old Russian Empire, is to use all of your colonials to do to bear the brunt of the fighting, and most of the casualties of the 56,000, however many killed, don't come from Moscow or St. Petersburg, which is a way to shield the elites from having to deal with the reality of what's going on. Now, I think that the will of the Ukrainian people, I was not surprised the Ukrainian soldiers would do well. We were working with them starting in 2015 as were UK and Canada, to help train Ukrainian soldiers. And I remember my sergeant saying, wow, these guys are really, really good. Had experience, very tech savvy. What I did not anticipate was how the Ukrainian people would respond and would come together. There was a wonderful thing on Twitter the other day. It said on 24 February, Ukrainians were Googling how to make Molotov cocktail. On 21 September, Russians were Googling for flights out of Russia. And so it's captures it quite well.
And do you think, I mean, clearly you can supply all the weapons in the world, but if you don't have those techniques, if you don't have that willingness to fight, but does it also help the fact that Ukrainians will also have been trained under Soviet techniques? So they sort of know what the Russian tactics are. They know how they're going to react in certain situations, but they've also got this layer of Western technique on top.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The Ukrainians, of course, especially the senior officers, were trained in the old Soviet system. They know everybody. This is why part of the reason for the success of sinking the Moskva, the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, is because the Ukrainian Navy knew exactly, every square inch of that ship, what its vulnerabilities were, such as it had radar that could only operate in 180 degrees, not 360. So meaning that if they could distract the radar, which they did with the drones, there would be a blind spot. That comes from that sort of intimate knowledge. And they also understand that Russia's logistics system is not designed for sustained land operations outside of Russia. And so therefore that they would depend heavily on railroads to move the enormous amounts of ammunition. And so the Ukrainians were able to figure out how do they target that because of this knowledge of the Russian practices. But I think as a result of Ukrainian soldiers serving alongside British and American soldiers and other allies for the past several years in Iraq and Afghanistan and then training with them, they have, and I don't want to overstate this, but they have evolved fairly rapidly into a more Western style command and control. Their authority is pressed down. Junior leaders are expected to make decisions, unlike the Soviet and now Russian system of a very centralized command and control.
The vertical, which we've heard so much about. And talking of railroads, which of course is critical to Russia's logistical operations, my understanding is that the towns of Liman, which are just about to fall, and Lysychansk, they're at the pivot points of the rail system that is supplying the Russian forces. So how critical could this be for subsequent advances?
Well, I would say, given the circumstances and the mass that the Russians still possess, being able to seize these various rail hubs has been a very important part of the operational design. When you talk about Kupiansk or Izium and now Liman, once you seize those, then the Russian forces really do have no choice but their only choices are to stay and fight until they run out of everything and then get killed or captured or withdraw. So again, to your earlier point, the Ukrainians understand the importance of these rail hubs necessary for resupply. Moving ammunition, and the Russian army is an artillery army. It's not a tank army, it's an artillery army. Moving thousands of tons of heavy, high explosive artillery ammunition, that is no mean feat. I mean, it's hard to do. So the more you can destroy the rail connections or deny those to the Russians, the more the burden it puts on their truck fleet, which has been severely attrited, as you would imagine, and not just any truck can carry artillery ammunition. So again, the Ukrainians, I think, have been very smart and methodical in eliminating or degrading Russian artillery by going after the supply system.
Because I believe they had a 20 to 30 advantage, 20, 30 pieces to every Ukrainian artillery piece. But they've cleverly targeted the ammunition depots with HIMARS, haven't they? Which again has been a morale booster, but it's also, I guess, been extremely practical. And they've also managed to capture an absolute ton of Russian equipment. So I wonder how much of that is usable, and does it help to reset the balance?
Well, long-range precision fires, which, by the way, is the #1 modernization priority for the United States Army, starting several years ago when General Milley, our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when he was chief of the Army, he made, so several years ago, long-range precision fires was the #1 modernization priority for the U.S. Army because of what you can achieve with at distance with a rocket that can hit, that's GPS guided, that can hit a target. So the Ukrainians, of course, I'd like to see us give them more of these launchers, but nonetheless, they have made very skillful use of the capability that comes with HIMARS or the MLRS and various other type systems. And I think that the Ukrainians deserve huge credit for how they have employed things. To be honest, I don't think there are any other soldiers in the world that are faster or better than they are at adapting to new technologies. I mean, they are very, very tech savvy. When we provided the Q-36 radar back in 2015, this is a counter-fire radar. It's basically a trailer that's pulled by Humvee, and it's ideal for detecting incoming artillery, mortars, and that sort of thing. So you get the early warning, but it also tells you point of origin. Where did it come from? So you can shoot back. And very quickly after we provided those radar, it was made clear to me that the radar is much better than I had realized. The Ukrainians made it better. So skillful employment is just as important as the technology.
And of course, they've got this very agile technique of firing and then moving extremely quickly so that they can't take that returning fire. And humor as well. I mean, Ukrainians were, I guess, respected, but also mocked sometimes for their humor back in the Soviet Union. But that sort of turn of mind seems to have helped. And they've been creating wooden HIMARS decoy units. And of course, even the campaign they recently did by convincing in the Russians they're going to attack in the south when actually they went hard on the north. There's a certain agility of mind and thinking behind that, isn't there?
Yeah, the deception that you're referring to of Kherson, drawing the Russians down towards Kherson so the main attack could go up near Kharkiv. I think many of us are going to be studying this for quite some time, the operational design of this campaign, but also in the information space. I mean, we had sort of ceded to the Russians, they're the best, they're the masters of, and actually it's clearly the Ukrainians are the best at this. I mean, I think by now most of us are a little bit wary when we see a report coming out of Kyiv about something that happens, like, okay, but they have done such a good job of capturing our imagination, and of course a lot of this emanates directly from the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky. On, I think it was day 2 or 3, when he's walking around Kyiv with his cell phone, saying, "Hey, I'm still here." And I thought, that is impressive. And of course, he's been very visible. He didn't leave, and he's been such an effective communicator. But I do remember thinking, how the hell is his phone still working? Yes. I mean, that would have been, US or UK would have taken out that from the very beginning. Yeah. But that revealed one of Russia's vulnerabilities. They were counting on being able to use the Ukrainian cell service.
That's right. And it's not just for military operations. They also need that infrastructure to pump their propaganda into people's heads. So it's that hybrid war necessity, extremely effective. I mean, turning now to the potential victory. Before I do that, I mean, staying on that campaign where they tricked the Russians, how hard is it to keep something that big secret? Because back at the start of the war, and certainly since 2014, there were a huge number of Russian moles and assets and paid informers embedded throughout the government, military, and administration. That's one of the reasons why Kherson fell so quickly, is because not artillery, but obviously the bribed politicians and folding very quickly. But how tough is it, in your experience, to keep such a huge operation secret? Because just one person blabbing about that would have ruined the entire thing.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because this has impressed me with the discipline that was required from the very top, and for deception to work, it has to be believable.
Mm.
And so there was so much talk about Kherson. It was the only oblast capital that had been captured in the last 7 months. It was a critical place on the Dnieper River, important port, and so there was all kinds of reasons to point toward, we've got to get it back.
Mm.
And not only that, but also to protect Odessa. You had to stop the Russians there. So it was so believable that was going to be the main effort. And of course, I remember people being frustrated. Very good professional journalists, as well as other professional observers of the conflict, people saying, where's the famous Kherson offensive? When's it going to start? And I'm like, they're not going to tell you when it's going to start. I mean, but everybody, or so many people, bought into it. So how did they manage to keep the surprise, the deception in play? And I think part of this, of course, is containing the information. Who knows, need to know, basic classified information practices, but also the discipline, because now, I mean, everybody has a phone. And so there had to be some real discipline to make sure that soldiers were not texting pictures of themselves somewhere that would give away, hey, why is he there? Why is that unit there? So I think there was that. And then the fact that they're moving through Ukrainian territory, so that they were able to, it didn't get out somehow what was going on. I'm impressed.
And I think earlier in the year, they did undertake immense purges of the administration, the security services, and in political circles. And of course, that was a gift to propagandists to say, look, they're undemocratic, etc., etc. But I think now it becomes quite clear why those purges were necessary to root out the Russian influence.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The counteroffensive didn't start, in September. It started probably back in May, when they began to realize, or they became more confident that the Russians were going to culminate in a couple of months. But I think they knew as early as May that the Russian forces would culminate in August, because the logistics system was not going to succeed. The morale of Russian soldiers, the will to fight, all these things were already becoming clear, even as Ukrainians were losing hundreds of soldiers a day to Russian artillery. The Ukrainian General Staff was able to think, and this is part of the how higher staffs have to think. We're going to take a pounding now, but there's going to come a time when the Russian forces will culminate, what Clausewitz called the culminating point, where the attacking force runs out of impetus, runs out of resources, runs out of will, for a variety of reasons. And of course, the reason Clausewitz talked about the culminating point is because you want to identify it, and if you can, accelerate your enemy towards this culmination, but then so you can plan your counterstroke. And so I think probably, I don't know this, but I would imagine probably as early as May, June, they were already beginning to think about how they would do this. And that would necessitate, of course, making sure that they didn't have leaks inside the government or the general staff.
And they must be thinking about what happens next. Clearly, they've got this technique of surrounding large towns without expending, huge forces in street-to-street fighting, and that's proving to be very effective. At some point, they're going to come up against the Russian border, aren't they? And there's two factors here. I mean, do you think winter is one of the biggest considerations here, and who is best kitted out to fight in the winter? And then my other major question was going to be, in order to force Russia to conclude a reasonable peace, are they actually going to have to occupy chunks of Russian territory like Belgorod and others? Because otherwise these places are going to be just lobbing missiles over, even if they've regained their full legal territories.
It's a very interesting question. first of all, to the weather. I think that I'm from Florida, so it's going to suck for everybody. And there are calls to provide winter clothing, winter equipment for Ukrainian soldiers. And so I think there are various efforts underway to help make sure that they've got what they need. But I feel quite confident in saying that the Ukrainians will not pause for the weather. I mean, this is not, the 19th century where armies would go into winter quarters. This is about keeping the pressure on the Russians, not giving them the chance to fix all the Legion problems that they have, or get themselves more properly prepared. So I think Ukraine will continue the attacks and the pressure as much as they possibly can, recognizing that weather will impact trafficability in some places, and rivers will be swollen with rains from the fall, and then visibility for drones. So there will be impacts, but not the kind of thing that's going to stop them the way it happened to the German Wehrmacht back in the war. Now, but something you said earlier did remind me. I mean, what they're doing is encircling tactics. Of course, this is exactly what their grandfathers did on the Eastern Front. Where you would the goal would be to encircle forces to bring about their surrender or enable their destruction. And so this is, I think, in their DNA. Now, the border is a very good question. I think the Ukrainians have zero desire to go across the border. I mean, I think President Zelensky has said that. Of course, they will probably be local reconnaissance and doing things, but there's no interest in taking territory. But they will have to deal with Russians as this continuing to shoot or fire missiles or artillery from the Russian side, which is why I disagree with my administration's policy about not providing ATACMS, because Ukrainians might use it to strike targets in Belgorod. Of course, that's what they ought to be able to do, because Ukrainian citizens are being murdered by missiles coming out of the Russian side of the border. But in the meanwhile, I think that this will be a challenge that they will have to deal with.
And from Belarus as well, of course, which, as we know, is just a puppet state now of Putin's, economically, politically dependent. They're also lobbing missiles from their territory. At one point, they were actually allowing troops to cross those borders. So again, somehow both of these countries have to be dealt with. But in your experience, do you think the fragility of the regimes in Russia and, maybe this isn't such an issue because the regimes will have collapsed even before Ukraine has taken its full territories, because Putin will be seen to be, a terrible loser at that point anyway?
So Belarus is a very interesting question. Lukashenko has thus far managed to sit on the fence, allow Russia to use it, airspace and bases and staging and all that, but none of the units of the Belarusian armed forces have gone into the fight. Now, they are worse than the Russian forces are in terms of quality, and they have the equivalent, I believe. Of course, I don't know this for a fact, but I believe they have about 10 battle groups total. A huge country, not with a huge population. And I think that Lukashenko is wary about letting his units go in there and get ground up, because protecting his own regime is job one for him. And I think he knows that he would have a real problem on his hands if his forces were sent in there. He'd be worried about the survival of his own illegitimate regime. I don't know how much longer he can sustain that, or he realizes that he's just got to gut it out because Putin will be gone next year. Maybe he sees that. I don't know. I do think that we're looking at the beginning, though, of the collapse of the Russian Federation. It is conceivable to me that by next spring, just like at the end of the First World War, you're going to see thousands of defeated Russian soldiers dragging their stuff back home, and they're going to go home to a country that has an economy that has been shattered by the resources that's poured into this ill-conceived campaign, as well as sanctions. And I mean, even in Russia, where, yes, of course, there are millions that believe and support what Putin is saying, I think that we are beginning to see fissures, particularly in the other outer regions.
Dagestan and in the south, yeah.
I was just about to say Dagestan. Chechnya, obviously, I think they see opportunity. And I think that the combination of all these factors, battlefield losses, sanctions, defeat, and corruption is going to lead to this breakup of the Russian Federation. Of course, there will always be a Russian state, but the Russian Federation, which is an artificial rump of the Soviet Union, of the empire, are we prepared? And, are we prepared for what that entails? We were not prepared for the breakup of the Soviet Union, I don't think.
No, I don't think we have any kind of plan to deal with it, and perhaps don't even appreciate the scale of the problem in dealing with Russia. In some ways, it's even more complex than perhaps dealing with Germany and Japan after the war. Certainly geographically, it's a much bigger problem there. Yeah. And turning, I think one of my last questions will be to, as Ukrainian forces uncover more territories, recover people, and start to hear the stories and find out what's happened on the ground. We're seeing terrible atrocities. And I know one of your roles is in human rights. What needs to happen on that front when this is all said and done? So
this is very interesting, and understandably, Ukraine and many others are talking about war crimes trials and all this, and absolutely there is a need for that. But I think that and already people are collecting plenty of evidence, and there will be no shortage of evidence for these kinds of things. But we don't want to lose sight of what has to be done first, which is to win this conflict. Don't lose. We don't want to make it easy for some, frankly, European allies to have excuses of not focusing on helping Ukraine win. So keep the focus on actually accomplishing the end state that we want. And then the tribunals and all that will come. Justice will be meted out, I have no doubt. Of course, in The Hague, it will take time. The UN will block anything, because Russia and China will block anything coming out of the UN. So I'm not holding out hope there. But the international courts in The Hague and so on, I think those will take time. But it will happen. I think as someone from Human Rights First, we are very concerned about the 1 million plus Ukrainians who have been kidnapped and deported, scattered all over Russia, which is in the tradition of Stalin. That's what Russia has done to Ukrainians now, and estimates of over 250, 300,000 kids, flown out of or taken out of Ukraine and distributed around Russia. I think that has to be one of the stated deliverables, is that Russia has to return these people.
Absolutely, that must be a condition for a peace. And in the long run, though, the future potentially looks quite positive for Ukraine. And they've shown their bravery, their resourcefulness, their quality of their IT services, their self-organization, and their power of being extremely resourceful. Not quite the same optimism for Russia, is there? Because they've squandered their hydrocarbon resources. The dependency they'd managed to cleverly build up amongst Europe and other countries is now shot. They've blown their own pipeline reputedly, but also arms was their second largest export, and their equipment has been shown to be, frankly, not quite up to scratch, has it?
Not at all. Everybody has seen the video of Russian issue helmets that, you know, a Ukrainian soldier with his fist is able to smash them in, or the reactive armor tiles that are layered around the tanks. You open them up and it's supposed to be an explosive inside there. Instead, there's rubber in there. And the reports about reliability of precision weapons, 30% failure rates. I mean, this is atrocious. And so I don't think that anybody will be too impressed or anxious to buy Russian equipment. And of course, with the sanctions, it will make it even more difficult for them to deliver certain things. I imagine our Turkish friends are staring at these boxes of S-400s, you know, like, God dang it. Now, they do produce some quality equipment. There's no doubt about it. But I think, again, the sanctions are going to play a role. And there's a realization also that even with the best, most modern equipment, such as what the Russian Air Force had, if you're not trained, if you don't know how to employ it, and it doesn't matter how expensive or how technologically advanced your equipment is, you have to have sergeants, you have to have people that are trained, you have to maintain these things, and you have to employ them correctly. And the Russians have not done that.
And have distributed command structures rather than the vertical command structure that we see.
Yeah, look, so all these generals that were getting killed at the beginning of the conflict, it's because they were on a cell phone. And, you know, a teenager can geolocate where you are. You're yakking away on a cell phone, and then of course it's easier to you target and you wipe out a headquarters because of a general officer yakking on a cell phone. And then they continued to locate headquarters, and they knocked these out. And so in this vertical command and control system, when you start taking out headquarters, it's not just the guy that's making the decisions. It's the staff around him that are doing analysis, that are anticipating what needs to be, you know, ordering up trucks to move this, or, you know, whatever. That's gone. And so now you've got junior leaders that are not accustomed to or willing to make decisions and make adjustments, because the guy above them is, you know, the headquarters is a smoking heap.
And my last question, because I know it's Saturday and it's a sunny day, so I'm sure you want to get out. But the last question is: have we seen a sneak preview in this war of, you know, how warfare in the future is going to evolve? Things like sort of drone swarms, you know, open source intelligence, very clever use of communications networks, distributed command. I know it's not a fully modern war, because of course artillery has played a part, and it's been incredibly intense and brutal as well. But are we starting to see how future wars might be won in this one?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because it's the future war is going to be that combination of who can rapidly assimilate new technologies the fastest, and who can be the most clever about basically crowdsourcing. I mean, you know, where the Ukrainian forces are operating, they're surrounded by thousands of sensors that know what's around. So, but you're still going to need to address the industrial base. The amount of ammunition that was consumed the last 7 months is so far more than we spent the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we have a challenge in all of our countries. Can our defense industries produce the quantity as well as the quality? And so this is going to be a challenge. Air and missile defense. I now have had to recalculate what I think the requirement is, because the Russians clearly are targeting populations. And so the amount of missile defense systems that we have is barely enough to protect critical infrastructure. So you need a lot more to protect populated areas. And this is something that I'm rethinking. But of course, the Chinese are watching all this. And the Chinese, who I think are 5 years away from being ready to go after Taiwan. President Xi said that the other day. He told his military, 2027, be ready for Taiwan. That's not an order to invade, but in terms of a target date. And that coincides with the end of what will be his third term, assuming he takes that third term here next month. So the conflict with China would be different in many ways from what's happening here. It obviously would not be such a land conflict, but the effectiveness of long-range missiles, the vulnerability of ships that don't have trained, disciplined crews, and clearly the Black Sea Fleet, which is cowering under the cliffs of Crimea, and Ukraine does not even have a navy. So I mean, think about that. So the importance of joint operations. I don't think there's been a day in the last 7 months where Russian Air Force, Land Force, and Navy operated together. They never got the joint, and so to get the benefit of all these capabilities, modern capabilities, it has to be in an integrated way. And then the last thing I'd say, Jonathan, is it still requires sergeants. It still requires soldiers who are disciplined and trained. There are many. I'm not a tanker, by the way, so I'm not defending tanks out of a personal love. But too many people were quick to say, "Oh, that's it, no more tanks," because look what happened. Yeah, every video I saw of a Russian tank getting destroyed, it was improperly camouflaged or not camouflaged. It was sitting out in the open. It was unprotected by dismounted infantry when it moved through. I mean, every mistake you could make has been on display, and they've paid the price with a destroyed tank on a TikTok video. So don't learn the wrong lessons about this. I don't know a single commander that would not want to have protected mobile firepower.
And of course, the Ukrainians are asking for that equipment. They must know that it's strategically important.
Exactly. They're not saying we don't want tanks, send us more drones. Like, no, you need all of this. It is a deadly, deadly battlefield.
Well, Ben, it's been a massive privilege speaking to you, hugely insightful. I know our viewers are going to probably watch this video several times over to pick out all the detail in there. And I'm incredibly grateful to you for spending your time on a weekend.
Well, once again, I am grateful to you for the privilege.